So like my dream is that like it is part of a local university's mission that they are going to make stuff and put it out there for public consumption on the local public television channels that is about the kind of knowledge being produced there in a way that captures the spirit of not just the university, but public broadcasting, which is that there are certain things that don't make money, but contribute to a greater good, right, in the culture.
Welcome to Continuing Studies, podcast for higher education podcasters to learn and get inspired. I'm Neil McFedrin from Higher Ed Pods and Podium Podcast.
And I'm Jennifer Lee, owner of JPod Creations. Podcasting is broadcasting, and we want you to know that you're not alone in this podcasting space, and we can all learn from each other.
Yes, that's right, Jen. If you listened to our previous episode, we're starting a new little segment here where we're trying to get some dialogue going with our listeners. Last time we were asking about launching and whether you want to launch with one or two episodes. And in this episode, what we'd like to know is if anyone out there who has been podcasting audio only for the last 1 or 2 years and is about to start to layer on video. There's a lot of conversation about it, but we'd love to hear from you. If you're in that boat, send us a note and tell us about your journey, and we'll talk about it on one of our upcoming episodes.
Very excited to hear from you.
Yes. So in this episode, Jen, we speak with Barry Lamb. Barry is professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, and he is creator host of the acclaimed narrative philosophy podcast, Hi-Fi Nation. It is an excellent podcast. I recommend you all give it a listen. We'll obviously put a link in the show notes. So I met Barry in New York a few weeks back, and Barry was one of the panelists at this symposium that I attended that was titled Podcast Intellectuals, Producing Original Scholarship with Audio. And it was hosted at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at New York University. So Barry actually took part in two of the panels. One was titled How Do Scholars Make Podcasts, which was very interesting. We get into that. And the other session he sat in on had a really provocative title called Can Podcasts Save the University? And there was sort of a sub context to it from itself. Super interesting. And I learned so much from Barry. So I went up to him after and I said, Barry, you got to come on Continuing Studies. So that's what we're doing today. So in this conversation following today, we chat with Barry about his journey from traditional academic scholarship into the world of podcasting, sort of, and specifically how Hi-Fi Nation bridges that philosophical research and narrative audio, really interesting. And then how that fits into his scholarly mission and his academia and his academic approach as well, too. So, and then we have a little bit of a larger conversation about the broader implications for academia and podcasting itself. So really interesting conversation with Barry.
Very interesting. So let's get started.
Let's go. Barry, it's so great to have you join us here on this episode of Continuing Studies.
I'm so happy to be here. Excited to talk to you both.
Great. So Barry, you were part of two really fascinating panels at the Podcast Intellectual Symposium at NYU a few weeks back. One of them really, the final one of the day, really caught my attention, has actually really gotten me thinking over the last bunch of weeks. The title was Can Podcasts Save the University? So we're going to dig into that, but I'd also love to get into your experience creating Hi-Fi Nation, which is just an amazing podcast. And as an aside, before I met you or was introduced to you, I was a listener of it and quite enjoyed it. So maybe let's start with Hi-Fi Nation. What first drew you to podcasting as a medium for philosophical storytelling?
Happy to hear that you're a listener. There's going to be a new season coming out in the new year. I've been really busy with the academic side in a way that I wasn't for the previous, whatever it was, 6 seasons. So looking forward to putting it out there. I was in my first sabbatical after tenure, and this was 2015. And I just felt like 2014, 2015 was kind of like I want to say the rise of the academic adjacent documentary kind of podcast. So precursors to my show, which were very big shows, some of which are still on, some of which aren't, were like NPR's Invisibilia, which was
Mm.
kind of like the show that married narrative storytelling with essentially research psychology, both cognitive and social psychology. And of course, even predating that was Stephen Dubner's Freakonomics, which was one of the very first things to take very technical economics research by scholars in the academy and pair it with ordinary journalism, right? The kind of things that are going on in the world. Economics was a great field for that. And I just wanted to, first sabbatical after tenure, it was like, here are these other papers you could publish. And I just didn't want to work on them. I couldn't find myself motivated to work on them anymore. And there was this medium. And of course, there are the artsier types. Radiolab has always been a show that paired storytelling with scientific research, sometimes
Mhm.
even the hard sciences, cosmology, biology, things like that. I wanted to learn how to do that. And I wanted to learn how to do that just by doing it. And so that's exactly what I did. I literally Googled Ira Glass, how do you make a episode of This American Life? And he actually gave a interview where he talks about the technicalities. He says, I buy this microphone. It's an Audio Technica 8035. They use like a Marantz recorder. And then he says, well, this is how I prep for the interview. And then after the interview, I transcribe by hand the whole thing. And as I transcribe each interview by hand, then I highlight or like I pull out different things that I think are great quotes. And then when I take all the quotes together, I can kind of foresee the story and then I can start writing around it. I just did that. I just did that. I did that for the very first story, which at that time I called it the pilot episode. And it took me 2 months to make it. It took me 4 months total. It took me about 2 months to collect the interviews. And
Mhm.
then it took me another 2 months to learn how to make that. And then you can still hear it. It's episodes 2 and 3 of the first season, Soldier Philosophers. And that's how it all got started.
That's so cool. Just a quick question on that because you talked about having to actually pick out the clips yourself. Now with AI, obviously they have tools that do it for you. But do you think being such a great storyteller and listening to these prominent people that do serial and other things like that, do you think AI can top that? Or do you think it picks the clips that you would predominantly go with?
The one thing that AI has greatly improved in my own workflow has just been like I don't have to transcribe anything anymore. And, in the beginning, I had to transcribe everything by hand, and then I had research students do that, and now it's instantaneous. The hardest part of the job is organizing all of that into a coherent story and then writing the narrative. That's what takes the longest, right? It takes
Right.
like 80 hours total for about a 45-minute episode to make that. And I've tried, right? I've actually decided to use the LLMs as a kind of editor, right? Like write me an intro. And the thing is, it's trained on my stuff. So I can actually tell it to write because I've been around long enough that I said, write it the intro in the style of a Barry Lamb Hi-Fi Nation episode. And it's got whatever it is, 60 whatever episodes to go on. So it's got my voice down okay. And I've noticed that it's helpful for me to ask it to do it in the styles of all these other people that have their very own distinctive kind of voices. But I would never use that because it's kind of like doing an impersonation, right? It's kind of like if I were going to do a cover of a song and then I could sing it the way I would sing it, or I could impersonate whoever. And in podcasting, it would sound like that too, right? There are people with distinctive voices and the AI can impersonate them, or it can be completely boring. But the act of giving AI the thing to do, no, I don't think it could that could pull it off.
I think that's really interesting. You're coming from an academic position, so there's some rigor, some academic rigor versus just non-academic podcasts that maybe can grab more from the AI or be more loosened and whatnot. It's still about the academia. That's still a really important component. And you're a professor and academic, so I think that's probably why you're still putting that much work into it.
Yeah, I think that's half of it. So the show is hopefully doesn't come across as it's done by an academic because I try
Right?
not to,
No, it
right?
does not. I
Right. And right.
completely.
So it's actually modeled after just what you would call classic public radio kind of documentary type audio. And what I bring to it is you're absolutely right about that. Ordinary reporter who doesn't have a PhD in philosophy would not be framing things the way that I
Yeah.
would. I've actually done pieces for Radiolab, and they actually cut out 90%. They were like, oh, our listeners aren't going to be interested in the ins and outs of labor policy or labor ethics or whatever it is. But I'm interested in that. And my listeners aren't. But that's just because when you're an academic, you kind of like nerding out just a little bit more than a journalist would, right? And
Yeah.
that shows. I think that's only half of it, though. I think, like there are so many different ways to tell a story, for instance. So every episode of Hi-Fi Nation's got like half philosophy, half storytelling. And the storytelling is like something happened in the world to somebody, and that person experienced a series of events, right? And there were stakes involved, there were losses or there were gains, right? And the way you tell that is different depending on your angle, right? Like the tabloidy version and what the angle would be. You could have the economics version of that, right? You could have the social psychologist angle on that. All of these things have different angles to which affects the structuring of the way you do your story. I'm not an AI disaster kind of person, but I'm pessimistic about its ability to do better than any of us right now. But which is not to say that it can't do better than beginners. I was a beginner, but I think after you had some experience, you kind of don't rely on because it just doesn't produce something that's usable.
Yeah. And I think the important thing is that it's not necessarily fact checking as well. And we're just taking it as gospel. You
That's a
can't
problem.
do that because it's going to be misinformation out there. And did you ever feel that you were like taking a risk by prioritizing podcasting over like more traditional academic heavy research publishing?
Yeah. It's interesting that you talk about it in terms of taking a risk. My thought at the time was that I was half out the door in academia. I realized as I was making the pilot and doing that work that really what was going on was I was really burned out. I couldn't even tell you today what side of academia I was burned out on. Was it like the teaching of the same kinds of things over and over for at that point 10 years? Maybe, I'm not sure. I changed things up. Was it like the peer review journal publication thing? So because I was feeling so burned out, I thought to myself that I'll just do something else and not care what my academic peers think about it. And so when I advise people today in the academic space, they think of it as risky because they really want to rise in the ranks of the academic prestige hierarchy and so forth. Insofar as that is your goal, it is kind of risky. I think it is risking it because the incentives involved in producing something like Hi-Fi Nation are very different than the incentives in academia. And I don't mean that just by monetary incentives or career incentives. Like your concrete goal is to be entertaining when you make Hi-Fi Nation. Your concrete goal in academia is to make sure that two peer experts don't think that it is unworthy of publication. And those are two very different kinds of goals when you're producing a thing, right? For instance, the whole academic thing requires you to be acculturated into citation practices of
Mhm.
your discipline. If you don't cite the right people or enough people, it's just something wrong with the thing that you're producing. So the fact checking thing I think is important, very important. And that's the incentives are kind of different there too, right? So in storytelling, everything you do has to tell some part of the story and not some other part of the story, right? And people get on journalists all the time for getting it wrong. And I do too,
Mhm.
for getting it like wrong or misleading, right? And so forth. So I think academics do it better than they do when it comes to the facts and like representing the views of a certain scientist or a certain economist or academic correctly or a certain historical figure correctly. I think we do better than that. But the medium itself incentivizes not that, but the most entertaining structure or bit.
Yeah.
And so because those are sort of at odds, it is risky, right? So that's why when you hear things made by myself or like Jill Lepore, it sounds completely different than the thing that
Yeah.
Malcolm Gladwell makes.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good segue into digging more deeply into podcasting as scholarship, then during the podcast intellectuals discussion, there was this recurring theme about how academia still treats the written monograph. And you kind of touched on it a bit there in your previous answer, but treats the written monograph as the currency of scholarship. I think that was the term that one of your fellow panelists utilized there. Why do you think that is? And then more so, how does podcasting challenge that a bit?
There's so many reasons why that is. The simplest reason is that it's just that's how academies were founded. They were founded on written texts and archiving, right? The medieval university is what I'm thinking of. It's what academics are trained to be good at. People recreate the conditions of their own success, right? The people who write the best papers are the people who are in the humanities and social science departments. The people who were bad at that did not succeed enough to go on through and get PhDs and so forth. That's one. And then there are the material reasons, which is that the thing that academics are supposed to produce are supposed to be archivable in libraries. That's the audience for the monograph. Like some of it is your peers who buy it, but that's probably going to be, if you're lucky, a couple hundred, right? Mostly all of these books from academic presses are sold to libraries for future research purposes. And these are all good things, but it means that the priority in the evaluation of whether an academic is doing a good job is the production of something that's in print and that's archived.
You were actually quite open with the group that was there that day, and you shared with us, and hopefully you're okay sharing on this podcast as well too, that Hi-Fi Nation actually played a role in your hiring at UC Riverside. What did that process reveal about how universities might be starting to rethink what counts as scholarship?
I do actually think that universities are rethinking what counts as scholarship. It's slow and it's not like systematic. It's not coming from, any big, huge trends. So I'll talk about my story first and then generalize. So I started the show, first season came out 2017, the beginning of 2017. So I spent 2015, 2016 working on it, that first season. And then I got basically a fellowship, a grant for essentially my whole salary paid for a year to make the first season of the show at Duke. It was one of these Mellon grants
Mm,
for faculty from liberal arts colleges who were doing non-standard projects, which is what I was. So it was just an amazing opportunity. And I set myself a goal that said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make one season of this and we'll see where it goes. And then after I made that first season, I couldn't stop. I said, I have to try to make another second season. I try to make a third and so forth. And I was able to get grant funding for it. And I was able to get a network interested in it. And it just looked like that's what I was going to be doing for my career. And also, that was the time where podcasting was receiving an inundation of venture capital. So it's different now. And so it looked like there might be boom times ahead. And then I just made whatever it was, 5 seasons or 4 or 5 seasons. But I had to go back to the job. I took half leaves, but 3 out of the 4 years I was able to do it full time. When I got back to the job, it was not only back to being a full professor, it was COVID
oh, wow.
and I had to be chair.
Oh,
Uh, there you go. So like
perfect
academics will
storm.
understand that because it was my turn. And it
Yeah.
was like, okay. And then there was just not a foreseeable way for me to continue making the show. So I was at
Mm,
Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. And that was where I got started and that's where I got tenure and so forth. And so essentially, right before I saw it coming, I put out to the various departments in the field, which contained people in it who were public scholarship curious or public scholarship experienced or something, that I was looking for a position that would allow me to do this work, at least have it count as part of what it is to be an academic in that department.
mm,
Because at Vassar, what it means to be at that institution is to teach 5 courses a year and serve the college. And,
mm,
research is part of it and monographs and all that. But even that is not as important because
mm.
it's a liberal arts college for elite kids. It was like, could I sustain this work? And I got a couple of bites and then COVID hit, and then everything was put on hiatus because you guys all remember that nobody had any money. That was a big crisis after the crisis of 2008-ish and 9-ish, and now we're in another crisis, obviously. We're in never-ending crises.
Yeah.
So that was all suspended and put on hiatus until, I don't know, 22? Something
Mhm.
like that, end of 21, in which case Riverside called and said, "We're still interested." Because at that point, I had already given a job talk there. They said, "Oh, we have this new dean who might very well be interested in you too." Turns out that dean, his name is Daryl Williams. In that time, I got enough prominence as like an academic who makes narrative podcasts to start giving seminars. And one regular seminar I'd given was at the National Humanities Center twice a year, once for graduate students, once for faculty. And I did that for whatever, 3, 4 years. My dean, before he became my dean at UCR, was at the University of Maryland. He was a public historian who got like a huge grant to do narrative stuff like monographs and websites and things like that. And as part of that, he took podcasting seminar and I was the keynote speaker. So he actually already knew me as like some kind of weird outlier. And it turns out that that's what he was interested in being like the dean for. And so what happened was I came back out, I gave another talk, I met with the dean, and I told them like this whole big vision of having an alternative set of work, right? That like humanists more generally, because he's the dean of the School of Humanities, do that is public facing rather than peer facing. That is, the audience for it is not other experts. The mediums are as diverse as the audiences are. So they could be video, they could be audio, they could be print, but different kind of print. And that kind of stuff ought to count in some way in the merit review, the hiring process, the merit review process, the promotion process, and so forth. And he agreed. And so he actually went back to the department and said, "Why don't you revise your tenure and promotion guidelines so the kind of work that Barry does is included in that?" And it's not, obviously, it doesn't mention me by name, so that other departments can follow and your own department for other people within the department. And we do have a couple of other people in the department that do things kind of like this. And so my whole hiring here was kind of like this little project of just like a few people. All right. And so now it is part of my job that I can make a season of this show and have it count. How much does it count? It's very bureaucratic. So other places it's kind of qualitative. It's like one journal article counts for 3 book reviews and it's
Oh,
like
wow.
that. So they literally have to like write out, okay, we'll say one episode is kind of like half a journal article and then something like that. So
Wow.
it's like that here.
Yeah, I just amazed at like everything that you're doing and then like paving the way for everybody.
Yeah.
So, what do you make of this whole idea of like journal of podcasting or some like formal accreditation body for scholar?
It's just absolutely hilarious to me. And that's absolutely hilarious that you're asking me because I am one of the most rebellious against the bureaucratization of the evaluation of quality and quantity. And academia has just moved in a direction that it's like more of that rather than less of that. And I absolutely despise it, right? And I'm at an institution where it's built in, where it's kind of like, well, let's say that the monograph counts for 3 of the, it's like that. So the idea to me that you would like, oh, you know what's great? People are doing this and like there's a few people doing it that have gotten jobs and they're trying to make it so that it counts so that other people can do it. Let's bring that back into a journal and then count an article in it. And then there are sets of experts at it that can evaluate each other. I understand why people are doing that because the internal incentives in academia have not changed, right?
Mhm.
It still needs to be the case that someone needs a letter of recommendation from a bunch of peers, and the peers better impress the dean and some committee that they are like the leaders of that area. You know, it's still on that model. And so obviously when an outlier comes in, they want to generalize and they're going to try to institutionalize it. But suffice it to say, they're gonna mess it up.
So instead of trying to figure out how podcasting fits into the existing system, it's like
Yeah.
we gotta blow it up instead of trying to force it in to the OG system. We gotta kinda rethink the whole thing. So I guess which then lends me to ask you, how can institutions and academia support podcast-based scholarship without losing what makes podcasting so distinct. Like its creativity, its accessibility. You kind of touched on it about what you're doing, where it's more
Yeah.
wider audience facing versus academia, your fellow peers facing. But I guess sort of baked within your pushback to the
Yeah.
Journal of Podcasting, sort of curious, like what are other ways to look at it then?
Well, so there are really light touch recommendations and then there are heavy
Mm,
handed recommendations. So, like the light touch things are if you have faculty, staff, postdocs who want to do this as part of their time, right? So, some part of their time has always been the research, but the output of that has
mm,
been, you know, a dissertation with a bunch of citations, all that. If this is just one of the kinds of outputs that somebody can produce, and that will be, like people in dance do performance recitals as like their output. They don't necessarily have to have a dissertation that's archived, although some dance programs do. You literally have to write the dissertation and archive it. And so if you just include as part of your outputs, right, audio series, then I mean, you're going to need more than just that because we all know that podcasting is just audio. It's like print. There's genres of it. Documentary series is completely different than you and a bunch of grad school friends just gabbing about something. And that's different from like an interview series, and that's different from oral history collection, stuff like that. So there needs to be genre conventions and there needs to be, counting it as output. There is going to have to be some institutionalization. There need to be people that do some evaluation outside of the university because it's still the case that letters of recommendation are one of the currencies for hiring and promotion and so forth. Committees need that kind of thing. If universities don't just treat it as a hobby that's not part of somebody's job, that just means counting what they're doing in it. That's the lightest touch. And I think people are prepared to kind of accept that. The much heavier handed kind of stuff involves funding, as we all know,
mhm,
right? Some of these things are expensive. It's gotten cheaper. Like the actual technical aspects of podcast production are cheaper than they were. So like hosting is not that expensive anymore. And you have all these things that we're using now. We don't have to pay for professionals to go with professional mics and record people for interviews and all that stuff. But if you really wanted to embark on a research project that like requires you to do substantive archival audio, go out to different places to interview people who are not available in this kind of context and put it all together, then that's going to require some kind of funding. I don't know how much universities will do that. Like they're willing to hire researchers for other things. I don't know why they wouldn't try to hire audio expert versions
mhm,
of that to help faculty actually produce the kind of thing that they're producing. Universities can really help supplement, I don't want to say take over, but supplement the kind of decline of public broadcasting.
I'm from media and traditional media, and we're seeing such a big shift in public media here. It's changing. So I was just telling people that regardless if you're in higher ed space or you're a business or whatever, you kind of gotta create your own kind of media company and your
Yeah.
own platform for broadcast. Because gone are the days that you're gonna be on the news unless you pay to play. It's like before you would submit your press release, maybe you would get in on the news or whatever. And it's like you don't have that now. I had a client of mine say that I want to be able to say when I can broadcast. And I said, that's what a podcast
Yeah,
is.
no, that's right. That's absolutely right. And that's exactly what I'm talking about, Jen. I actually think that universities are in a better position than a lot of other institutions to do it.
right.
Number one, we're already nonprofit mission driven as opposed to like like Goldman Sachs is not going to step up. Like Goldman Sachs, I'm sure has a podcast, right? And Goldman Sachs has all the money in the
And I
world, but
think they've actually someone from Goldman Sachs put money or hosted one of the university podcasts we talked to actually.
right. But as an institution, it's not aligned with the kind of things like at the end of the day, what Goldman Sachs is going to put money into is what they've always put money into. There's going to be some like political
Making more
shows and all that.
money.
Yeah, but making more money. A lot of the stuff that we do in the academic space is not all that different from a lot of the kind of things that have been done in public broadcasting in the 20th and the early part of the 21st century, right? And if anything, we're the sources, whereas they are like there are filmmakers and so forth, video makers and all that, but we're like the source material, right?
But I
So
think the other problem is, which you touched upon, and we kind of dealt with this at university, is when they make these podcasts, whatever their idea is to interview entrepreneurs or to do scholarly stuff and like go into like different areas is they don't understand how it helps other things in your university, like website SEO and all that. Like they don't realize there's so much gold behind that podcast you created for 5 years. They're just so focused on the numbers, and even that's skewed wrong. They look at the numbers being like, oh, well, we only get 1,000. And it's like, well, that's better than nothing. That's like 1,000 people in a room. And so they're quick when the budgets come up and they're like, "Oh no, something's happened and we got to cut the budget." They're like, "Let's get rid of the podcast."
Another thing that happens is when things get too institutional. Like, so when I left Vassar, I hate to pick up my old institution. They were great. I'm going back to visit. But, because I was doing this and there were a couple other faculty inspired to do this, the college decided to do their own version of it. But when you go through the communications office, like when you go through all the formal, PR people, it's going to come out sounding like a PR thing. And but when faculty do it, it sounds it's independent, it's scholarly, right? It's not a representation of the university. So like my dream is that like it is part of a local university's mission that they are going to make stuff and put it out there for public consumption on the local public television channels that is about the kind of knowledge being produced there, maybe nationally if it's a national leader in something, in a way that captures the spirit of not just the university, but public broadcasting, which is that there are certain things that don't make money, but contribute to a greater good, right, in the culture. And
Yeah.
there's an audience for it. They're just not consumers. They may donate, but a lot of them don't.
Right. Well, this has been such a great conversation, and I think we could just keep sort of digging in multiple layers. And obviously, that symposium dug a bit deeper into that. But before we wrap, I'd just like to hear a bit what's next for you and for Hi-Fi Nation. So you mentioned off the top that there's an upcoming season, but what's next for Hi-Fi Nation, and or what are some of the themes or directions that you might be
Yeah.
thinking about exploring?
Sure. So I actually have collected all of the what in business we call tape. And it's just a matter of putting the episodes together. I have a couple of episodes put together. This next season, I'm going to return to the anthology aspect of the show. So philosophy touches on all kinds of areas in life, not just one kind of theme. I've done theme-based seasons. So there's going to be a lot about the connection between philosophy and various kinds of aspects in science, right? So there's going to be an episode about the early COVID vaccine, actually.
Mm.
During the rollout of the COVID vaccine, I don't know if either of you remember, but there was a time where it spoiled so quickly that if you open like a vial and you couldn't vaccinate, like, and they threw it away, but nobody knows the story of how that got solved. So I actually discovered that the story of how it was solved was actually really fascinating. So there's an episode about that. There's going to be episodes about people who are doing tissue engineering to try to promote human longevity. So, basically, let's grow Neil's like a set of brain cells that his own brain won't grow. And they're like, what'll happen if we actually put it in? Will it help like that brain rejuvenate in such a way? Things like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Those are some really interesting topics.
Oh, totally. A lot of the biotech stuff is just absolutely fascinating to me.
Yeah. Well, Barry, we'll end with one question here for the audience. What advice would you give to scholars or departments who want to start a podcast but aren't really sure how to align it with their research, or I guess in this case, we got into tenure goals?
Yeah. Yeah. What I say to graduate students, what I say to everybody, just start and do it and think about whether you want to do it later, which is the funny thing to say. But really, like if you're dithering about, it's because you're scared and you think
Mm.
it's risky and you're risk averse. One of the things I always say to people, doing nothing is also risky. I think the biggest problem with all of higher education is that within the last 15 years, everything has been about seeing everything else as an investment and a return.
Mm,
Students see it as an investment or a return. People who are faculty are they like, is this thing a good investment on return? And I think it's just part of this kind of really noxious set of concepts that we've gotten from the financialization of the American economy that we have made everything about incentives and returns. And I could speak in that language, right? I could also say, well, doing nothing is risky in the following way. The returns will be completely predictable, but always low, right? I mean, the whole thing about how the students should think about their education, is it a good or not good investment? What has completely gotten lost in all of this is, are you setting yourself up for a good life adventure? And there was a period where college students thought about that a lot more than about the return. And maybe because on the other end, they were a little bit more secure about where their economic position was. But I don't think that's it.
Because the students too, it's like it's not an instant return. If you don't go after university and say you become a lawyer, but if you don't go and do the steps to be a lawyer and work at a firm, you're not going to see a return anyways on that law degree.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right.
well, that's great. Really appreciate your time today, Barry. It was really interesting to dig into both your experience with Hi-Fi Nation, but also the academic world of podcasting and what's happening there. And there's lots of things moving and shaking, and it'll be interesting to see how things transpire over the coming years for sure. And good luck with your next season.
Thank you. And good luck to you too here on your show, Continuing Studies. Looking forward to hearing the episode and more episodes.
Great. Thank
Sounds
you.
great. Thank you.
Jen, another awesome conversation. I really enjoyed that discussion with Barry, not only about his podcasting journey and his critically acclaimed podcast Hi-Fi Nation, but also just really appreciated how he was quite transparent about his academic career as well too, and how podcasting fits into that.
Yeah, I'm just really glad that you were able to meet with him and get him on our podcast. So it was, yeah, a great conversation as always. And just a reminder, if you want to chat with Neil and I, answer our question, which we had at the beginning, which is, have you been doing a podcast with audio for a long time and are thinking about or are currently transitioning into video? We would love to chat with you here on Continuing Studies Podcast.
Drop us a line. Drop us a line on LinkedIn or
Slide in our DMs. That's what the young people are saying.
slide into our DMs.
Slide into our DMs. Okay, on that note, this is when Neil and I try to be cool.
Got our producer is shaking her head at us right now, but that's fine.
That's fine. Thank you for tuning into the Continuing Studies Podcast, a podcast for higher education podcasters. We hope you found this episode informative and inspiring. If you enjoyed the show, we encourage you to follow and subscribe to our podcast on your preferred platform so you'll never miss an episode. But if you found this episode particularly valuable, please consider sharing it with your friends and colleagues who also might be interested in higher education podcasts. We also invite you to join your peers on higheredpods.com, where you can connect with other podcasters in higher education and learn from others in the field. Thank you for being part of our community. We look forward to continuing to bring you valuable insights and conversations around higher education podcasts. See you in the next episode.